And here we go again. It's a Wednesday night, and this is a ham radio class for those who might be interested in getting your amateur radio license here in the United States. I'm your instructor. Gary is my name. Ham radio call sign Whiskey 4 Echo Echo Yankee. And we're happy to have you with us. We go each week chapter by chapter from this book, the American Radio Relay League License Manual, 5th edition, available on Amazon and also from the American Radio Relay League's online store. It's about $30 for a printed version, and this has all of the questions and answers that might appear on your amateur radio test. You get your ham radio license by passing a 35-question multiple choice test. No Morse code required anymore. That used to be a requirement. And so tonight we're going to be talking about Chapter 4 in the book, Propagation, Antennas and Feed Lines. But just to give you a little background, we're here in the upstate of South Carolina, in Anderson, South Carolina, actually Piedmont. It's between Clemson and Anderson. And in the upstate here, we are in a tropical storm warning. We're nowhere near the coast, but Hurricane Helene is on its way. It's just to the west of us at the moment, or at least the first front. Asheville, North Carolina is getting hit right now. But Thursday and Friday of this week, we're going to experience some severe winds, rain up to about 11 inches here in Anderson, and wind gusts potentially up to 70 miles an hour. So I'll tell you about my station now and the antennas that I have later in the class, but those antennas might not be there next week. So stay tuned to see if we survive Hurricane Helene here in the upstate. But it's always great to have your ham radio license because you can listen in on local amateur radio repeaters, including here in the upstate. We have a National Weather Service Skywarn repeater, and so we can hear the bulletins as they come in from observers around in the area of trees down, power problems, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to be interesting, but ham radio actually helps to keep you connected with what's going on. So get your ham radio license, if for no other reason, to stay connected in times of emergency. All right, let's get started. Chapter 4, Propagation, Antennas, and Feed Lines, and we're going to start with propagation. And propagation is just the ability to get radio signals from point A to point B. And I love this diagram, the curvature of the Earth diagram from ham radio school. They talk about a 6-foot individual there on the right. He's walking with his handy-talkie. Like I've got one right here. Hard to see in a little bit. And so about 6 feet tall. What's the range of a little radio like this? You know, you'll see them advertised. Oh, this radio's 20 miles or whatever else. No. The bald earth, meaning that there's no trees, no buildings, just earth, flat, you can go out 3.5 miles before you hit the curvature of the earth and your line of sight signal from 6 feet up stops. Now, if you've got two 6-foot individuals, you might be able to go a little further out if they're at the 3.5 mile marker. But that's about the direct line of sight range for these on the ground. Now, things change when somebody gets up higher, if they're in the mountains or things like that. Then that 20-mile range is certainly possible. But I just wanted to point that out, that, you know, people say, Gary, I want to get a 20-mile radio. Well, okay, let's talk about that. Here's some reminders on the right that radio waves are electromagnetic waves. The range of a radio signal is the distance over which a radio transmission can be received, and the radio horizon is the distance which two stations can communicate by using what we call the direct path signals. And as I mentioned, with line of sight, if you have obstructions in the way, like on top there's that hill or the mountain, and you've got a tower there on the left that's not so high, well, you're not going to reach the house on the right, the point B. However, if you put up a humongous tower for VHF and UHF, then potentially you can get up over obstructions and then make the contacts out further. So that's line of sight distance. VHF, UHF, and above are all line of sight modes of communication. So theoretically you have to be able to see. Now, interestingly, radio goes farther than light. Radio waves are actually refracted around the curvature of the Earth, so you get an additional 5% of distance because the radio horizon extends slightly farther. So that's one way to know where your potential contacts can be made if you're on VHF. A trick you can do if you're near the mountains with sharp peaks, or you're in the city with buildings with sharp edges, something called knife edge diffraction is a mode that you can, with VHF and above signals, you can beam signals toward the sharp points of a building or a mountain or what have you, and again, refraction and diffraction will occur, and the signal is actually curved around the object, and so radio signals in this case can go around barriers. And barriers are everywhere. So if you've got your tower here on the left and you want to talk to that handy-talkie there on the lower right, the direct line, for example, is being obstructed by vegetation, trees, a forest or whatnot, which for VHF and UHF can cause some signal loss. Note also that there's, let me turn on my laser pointer here. So if we go up here, notice here's some buildings here, and we have a reflection going on with the signal coming out, reflecting off of the building and going off to the handy-talkie receiver. Hey, that's great. Oh, here's another one. Here's a knife edge diffraction going on from this location and coming off and then going. So notice that in this case, you're actually receiving 3 different signals. And that can be good or it can be bad. It's known as multipath. And the signals that come from the various different directions can be additive. They can strengthen the signal that you receive. Or the interesting thing is they can change phase and they can be subtractive, so that you have a strong signal here and you've got an out of phase strong signal here. They can cancel. We'll look at an instance of that. But multipath and reflection and diffraction are all modes of propagation on VHF and UHF. Now, reflection can work to your advantage. So at my old QTH, when I lived in Greenville County, South Carolina, I was on the west side of Paris Mountain. And in Spartanburg, Channel 7 WSPA was on the east side of Paris Mountain. So I had a real hard time getting a direct signal from WSPA, a VHF signal, because Paris Mountain was blocking the line of sight. But what I discovered, I had a directional TV antenna on my house. I was able to rotate the antenna to look toward downtown Greenville, South Carolina. And when I did that, what I found was that the signal was coming from WSPA, bouncing off buildings down there in Greenville and over back to my house. So you can use things like reflection or refraction to your advantage. Now, I mentioned multipath and mentioned that you can have additive signals and subtractive signals. How many of you listening to FM radio in your car? Remember, FM is VHF. It's about 100 megahertz, thereabouts. And you're in your car, you're listening to your great tune. Uh-oh, got a red light coming up. So you're slowing down, and you come to a stop at the light, and all of a sudden, your favorite song is playing, and then the signal goes away. Where'd the signal go? But you find if you creep the car up just about a foot, maybe 2 feet, the signal comes back. What's that all about? That is multipath. You have actually gotten a position when you stopped your car where signals were coming in from different directions and they were subtractive, such that they canceled each other out and you had no signal. You lost your favorite tune. But just by moving a short distance, then you change the equation, and that subtractive signal maybe went away, and you were able to receive the VHF signal, your FM radio station that you wanted. That's what that is all about. That's multipath on VHF. Now, multipath can occur on all frequencies, VHF, UHF, but also very low frequencies, medium frequencies, short waves. On the high frequencies, also known as shortwave, multipath is caused by ionospheric reflections. What happens with shortwave is we send signals up to the ionosphere and it's refracted back down a very long distance away, thousands of miles away. These are the signals in the HF frequencies between 3 and 30 megahertz. And so if we're going to do long distance direct station-to-station communications, this is what we use. But the ionosphere is not a perfect reflector, and so not only does you get a signal through, but you get maybe multipath, different directions of signal. So you'll hear signals come up, and you'll hear signals go down in strength. We call it QSB in the Q codes. We'll learn about Q codes. It's signal fading, up and down and up and down. That's caused by the ionosphere. More likely when you get your technician license, and you will get your technician license, you'll be on your handy-talkie like this TID Radio H3, and you'll have it programmed to talk into the local area repeaters, VHF or UHF. Multipath will come into play there as well, because you'll actually hear ham say this to somebody if they're trying to talk to you through a repeater, and you move in one direction, and all of a sudden your signal might go away. And when it's time for them to talk, they'll say, hey, we lost your signal about halfway through, you're off your X. So multipath works both in transmit and in receive. So you'll find in your house, there's probably going to be a sweet spot, a location that may be in front of a window, it might not, where you can reliably hear and transmit to the local repeaters. Then you've found your X. That's where you want to be to make communications. So that's multipath. We're talking about voice modulation here, but it affects all sorts of different kind of modulation, including digital signals. This is packet radio, which is an early form of digital communications, akin to bulletin board systems and modems back in the day, using radio. But if you have multipath interference on a digital circuit, what happens is errors start to increase, and your bit error rate goes up. So with multipath interference on data signals, whether it be VHF or HF, the error rate will go up, and you'll have to retransmit or retransmit in order to get a signal through. So just be aware of that. And remember, blue text usually refers to an upcoming test question. We'll see that here shortly. I mentioned absorption with that one signal going through the tree line there. That is true with VHF and UHF signals. You'll find that your range is greater in the winter. And the reason being is the leaves on the trees will absorb VHF and UHF signals. So just keep that in mind. If you're going to be on your radio driving along in a town especially, you might have somebody comment to you on the local repeater, hey, your signal has a lot of picket fencing. Picket fencing? What are you talking about? So you look at the picket fence here in the photo and you'll see that it's got a slat and then a space, and then it's got a slat and then a space. Or you can liken it to the signals going up and then coming down to nothing, and then going up and coming down to nothing. You'll hear it on your local repeaters. If somebody's mobile and whatnot, you'll hear this ch-ch-ch-ch-ch-ch as they go along, and the signal level goes up and the signal level goes down. That's called picket fencing. And it is a real phenomenon that happens with VHF and UHF signals. Should you have VHF or UHF? Well, it depends on what you want to do, but for building penetration, UHF signals are typically better than VHF signals. The 2-meter band means that a wavelength of that signal is 2 meters long, or well over 6 feet. And so to get a radio wave into the building unobstructed, that's a lot. 70 centimeters, UHF is much smaller. So UHF has better building penetration than VHF, typically. Your mileage may vary. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about wavelength and impediments. Come on back to me, Bruce, if you would. So I have a rich history working in broadcasting in a number of interesting jobs. And I got a chance to work for, I'm originally from Michigan, work for a PBS TV station. WUCM TV was the call sign then. I think they've changed now. That was at Delta College. Now it's Delta University up in the mid-Michigan. Anyway, PBS was one of the first television networks to use satellites to distribute their network signals. And they didn't just have one network signal, but they actually distributed 4 network signals via C-band satellite. And C-band satellite is the ones that require the really big satellite antennas. And so at this TV station, we had a very large 6-meter, I think it was, receiving satellite dish that we would point at the satellite that was being used by PBS, and we'd get our signal down. This was back in the 1980s, so television networks, the commercial networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, took a look at this and they said, we're paying AT&T lots of money for their microwave system. Why don't we go on satellite like PBS did? And so NBC did that. And so I left the PBS station and I went to work eventually for an NBC affiliate in Saginaw, Michigan, about the time that NBC had made the transition over to satellite. And the one thing about the PBS system, it was very reliable, almost 100% uptime. Well, if we look at the slide there, if we can, Bruce, NBC at the time, they didn't elect to go C-band, which is about a 4 gigahertz frequency, 3 to 4 gigahertz. They said, no, we're going to use KU band. And the KU band requires smaller dishes. Okay, that's great. And operates between 11 and 15 gigahertz. They're microwave frequencies. And the wavelength of a KU band radio signal is only less than an inch, depending on the frequency that's involved. And remember I told you that PBS, great reliability on C-band? NBC discovered that KU band systems suffer from something called rain fade. And if you have DirecTV or Dish TV, you may have experienced this at home. When it rains, the signal can go away. Well, NBC, if they had rain at their uplink in New Jersey, the signal would go away for the entire network. If it rained over Saginaw, Michigan, where we were, well, we might lose the signal, but other stations would have. Rain fade is a problem for very short wavelength signals. So just be aware of that for very short, very small, that the water molecules can absorb the energy and block the signals. They tried all sorts of different things. I don't know what they finally resolved to do, but they overcame the difficulties. So what about other signals, though? So here, this is a test question. What are the effects of fog and light rain on 6 and 10 meter bands? The 6-meter band and the 10-meter band, 50 megahertz or 28 megahertz in this case. Think about it. Remember, with the really teeny tiny microwave signals, the rain could absorb. But with these really large relatively wavelengths, 6 meters or 10 meters, fog and rain has no effect. No effect whatsoever on 6 and 10 meters wavelengths because they're too long, they're too large to be impacted by the water molecules. So just wanted to bring that home. Anybody fancy a road trip? I'd like to be in the car that had this radio. I can't imagine, but this has got to be a classic. But on medium wave, anybody listen to AM radio in the United States? We call it the AM radio band, but internationally it's known as the medium wave or medium frequency band. And there are two modes of propagation in medium wave. And we share the 160 meter ham band is also a medium wave band. And the two primary modes of propagation for medium wave signals are ground wave, where the signal goes along the curvature of the Earth, or sky wave, where the signal goes up to the ionosphere and is refracted back down to the receiving location. So the ground wave, if you've listened to an AM radio station during the day, will typically go 60, 70 miles, maybe a little longer. What happens is the energy of the radio wave actually follows the curvature of the Earth. So it comes off of the vertical antenna tower. AM stations always use vertical antennas, and the polarity of the signal follows the curvature of the Earth. That's the ground wave signal. And it actually, I found this interesting, it actually tilts at the end and actually is absorbed by the Earth. So that is the ground wave signal. And nighttime, though, is when you can receive the sky wave signal. I'll show you why here in a sec. Sky wave signals use the ionosphere, as I mentioned. And notice the ionosphere is way up here at the top. Down here we have the Earth, and then you've got the troposphere, the stratosphere, the mesosphere, and the ionosphere is up here at the very top. And the ionosphere is impacted by sunlight. And so during the day, distinct layers form in the ionosphere, this uppermost region of the Earth's atmosphere. And we have the F layer at the most distant, the E layer, and then down at the bottom, the D layer. This is when the sun is ionizing the ionosphere, the atmosphere, and the Earth. But when the sun goes down, when it's nighttime, notice that the D and E layers are gone. They've actually disappeared. And I call the D layer the dead layer because the D layer absorbs medium wave signals. Here's another look at it. During the day, we have these four distinct regions of the ionosphere, where at night, typically you're left with just the F layer, occasionally some of the E layer. Now the E layer is interesting, and we'll talk some more about that here in a second, but the E layer and VHF, you can get actually long distance communications off of gaseous clouds that exist in the E layer. They're not fully understood even now, and the propagation might last only for 10, 15, 20 minutes. But I've done E layer communication on a VHF 6 meter phone from South Carolina to California. So it is possible to do long distance communications over the E layer. We'll talk a little bit more about it here in a second. So here are some terms that we need to know. And I actually heard this being discussed on the air today on the HF band, so I thought that was interesting. The critical frequency. And this is going to change from day to day and from location to location somewhat. But for that day, there is a critical frequency that, so you start going up in frequency, 30 megahertz, 50 megahertz, 100 megahertz. Well, at a certain frequency, below that frequency, signals will be refracted by the ionosphere and coming down. So here we've got 5 megahertz and 20 megahertz. But notice here, if we go up to 100 megahertz, the signal doesn't refract back down to Earth, but it actually is bent and goes off into space. VHF and UHF signals, especially UHF, go into outer space. That's the reason why NASA uses UHF to communicate to space missions. And when we had the Apollo going to the moon, all of that communication was UHF because it was above the critical frequency. It would not be refracted back down to Earth, and it would go straight out into space, and they were able to utilize it for space communications. But for ham radio operators like myself, for me, the fun part is talking over long distances, and for that I need HF. I need the ionosphere. So here again are the four layers, the F layer, the E layer, and the D layer. And the F layer is actually divided into the F2 and the F1. The ionosphere is affected by the sun and by sunspots. Sunspots? What are sunspots? Well, they're actually dark areas on the sun, which are involved in nuclear explosions going on the sun, and there's a cycle of sunspots. And so every 11 years we have a lot of sunspots, and then it goes back down to very few sunspots, and then again back up. We are right now at this point in time at a maximum for sunspots. We are right here. Now it's not as strong as some other preceding sunspot cycles, but it's pretty strong. And right now, long distance communication on HF on the upper frequency bands, 10 meters for example, excellent. You can actually communicate with very low power, very long distances. And by sunspots, if we look optically at the sun, that's what they look like. And here is the absence of sunspots, where you have a clear solar disk. Sunspots impact the higher frequency HF bands, especially 6 and 10 meters. They benefit from more sunspots, and you're able to get long distance propagation on 10 meters, for example, during daylight hours. Now, at night, that falls off, and 10 meters is not a good band for nighttime propagation generally. And here again, 28 megahertz, 10 meters, we're looking at the various modes of refraction coming back down to the Earth. So I used to work for the Voice of America. Your tax dollars at work. VOA was, when I joined in 1988, part of the United States Information Agency, and USIA's job was to tell America's story to the world. Well, VOA's job was to tell America's story to the world by radio. And so I was a field engineer and was sent overseas to overseas transmitting stations. And I got a chance to work. My first overseas assignment was Liberia, West Africa. I got to work in Munich, Germany, Tangier, Morocco, Colombo, Sri Lanka. It was an interesting, fascinating time. That was back when international shortwave broadcasting was still a going thing. It's pretty much died off now. It's just too expensive to operate. But back in the day, VOA was very innovative in some of the things that they did. And one of the things that they had to do in the Philippines was using tropospheric communications. So we go to the slide here. You'll see here these satellite antennas. Well, they're not really satellite antennas because they're pointing to the horizon. They're not pointing up into the sky. And they operated typically on UHF, about 300 megahertz. And in the Philippines, they established a link between the VOA receiver site at Baguio in the Philippines down to the transmitting site at Poro Point. And this was very reliable communications using radio, not microwave, but 300 megahertz using tropospheric ducting. And so for tropospheric communications, I want you to think tropical. Think of the Philippines. Think thermal layers. That's what tropospheric communications is all about. And hams can take advantages of this as well. If we have a region of thermal inversion, for example, so normal conditions here are here on the left with warm air on the bottom and cold air up in the atmosphere. But if we have the situation where we have cold air, then warm air, then cold air, this warm air duct here can carry radio communications, VHF and UHF, and go up thousands of miles. And usually you'll hear this sort of thing happen in the spring and in the fall, where you'll actually hear radio signals coming in from distant radio repeaters. For example, here in South Carolina, we can hear radio repeaters up in New England during these times coming in. It's really interesting, and it's using thermal inversion or tropospheric ducting. When we're sending signals up, I know I'm bouncing back and forth here a little bit, but bear with me. When we're sending signals up to the ionosphere, normally there is an area where we're going up to the ionosphere and then down to a receiving location. This area in between is called the skip zone. The signal doesn't come down there, so normally you shouldn't be able to receive any signals there. However, as I mentioned earlier, the ionosphere is not smooth. It's not, flat reflective. It's kind of bumpy and lumpy and whatnot. And so sometimes you'll get reflections back down, and this is known as backscatter. So somebody here in the region where you really shouldn't be receiving radio waves will be able to receive, and so know about backscatter propagation. And you'll hear this talked about on the air as well. As I mentioned, jumping around, hams do all sorts of strange things. We are opportunists. We take advantage of conditions as they present themselves to us. And there are meteor showers that happen on a regular basis. And you can actually then, with the right equipment and antennas, you can actually send radio energy up to a meteor shower and have signals refracted or reflected back down. This normally is on 6 meters because the wavelength of 6 meters matches the nominal size of meteor trails. So this is known as meteor scatter. 6 meters is the band of choice for that. Now, 6 meters is also interesting if you have geomagnetic disturbances going on the Earth, and this happens because of solar activity. So astronomers and others like it because it gives you aurora borealis or aurora australis in the southern hemisphere. It's because of the disruption of the Earth's magnetic field that you get these patterns in the sky. Well, hams have discovered that you can actually bounce signals off of the aurora. You take your antenna and you point it straight north for us in the northern hemisphere. And so listen here, this is a QSO from a Canadian station, VE3EN, and let's see what it sounds like.
5 and 8, Aurora. 5
sounds kind of freaky.
Aurora, Fox, November 3-2. Call is Kilo Charlie 2, Whiskey Lima, radio, over.
Yeah, QSL, nice to see you again, and beautiful signal on the Aurora, 5 and 9 Aurora here, 59 Aurora, Fox, Norway, 2-5, over.
QSL, Kevin, you're also 59, 73, thank you.
73 and good luck, Victor Echo 3, Echo November, I'm going to QSY up 5.
QSY, one of those Q codes, it means change frequency.
QRZ, Victor Echo 3, Echo November, Victor Echo 3, Echo November, QRZ. Alpha 1 Tango Tango, nice to see you, nice signal, 5 and 7, 57 Aurora, Fox, Norway, 2-5, Fox, November, 2-5, over.
Yeah, QSL, please copy 5-8 Aurora, and 2 Foxtrot, November 3-3, FM 33, over.
QSL, thanks for Fox November 3-3 and enjoy the opening. We're a lot of strong signals out there. Alpha 1 Tango Tango, Victor Echo 3, Echo November 73.
So what you heard there, that's what it sounds like when radio signals are being reflected off of the aurora. That distortion and that varying signal strength, that's a normal part of that mode of communication. And what they were giving there was a signal strength report, 5.9, and they were giving their Maidenhead coordinator, their Fox November 3.3, for example. That's where the station is located. And that's information that is usually exchanged in VHF and UHF long-distance contacts. I mentioned my long-distance contact on 6 meters out to California. That was using the E layer, which those gaseous clouds that sometimes come up, and because it is sporadic, okay, we call it sporadic E. And as I mentioned, folks really don't fully understand yet these E clouds. So maybe that's something you can research if you're interested in. So we mentioned the critical frequency before. That's the frequency at which above that it won't be refracted back down to Earth. Well, here's some other terms of art. The luff and the muff. The luff is the lowest usable frequency. And the muff is the maximum usable frequency between any two locations. And it's used for medium frequencies and high frequencies, the muff and the luff. The higher ham bands, for example, will work better during the day for distant transmissions because they utilize sunspots. But lower ham bands have a chance at long-distance transmissions at night. So knowing the muff and the luff and propagation conditions on these bands can help you considerably. Well, how do you know this? Well, I'll show you here in just a sec. But one other mode of propagation between daylight and darkness is gray line, or it's that band between sunset and then in sunrise in the morning where it's kind of twilighty. That gray line actually extends around the Earth. Now this is a flat projection map, so it doesn't look this, but this is the gray line as it existed at this point in time. And actually radio signals tend to be ducted through the gray line. So if you're out here in Arizona, for example, and you want to talk to somebody in Eastern Europe, this would be a great time to make a gray line communication. It'll only last during the time period of this twilight. But gray line propagation is another mode that you can utilize. Well, Gary, how do I know the muff and the luff and all that other stuff? Again, your taxpayers' dollars at work and the VOA to the rescue. The Voice of America Coverage Area Prediction Program, VOA CAP, is available online here at this URL. And you can put in the information about your station, your antenna's power level, and where you want to communicate to. Let's say Tuvalu in the Southern Pacific. You put in their specifications, and it'll give you this rosette, which is a clock face actually, that shows you that these bands in red and these times are the best time that you would have to communicate between, in my case, South Carolina and Tuvalu. So this VOA CAP, we used it in Voice of America for our international shortwave broadcasting. We wanted to know if transmission from Kavala, Greece, for example, would reach the Soviet Union and what were the best frequencies and times to send that transmission. That's what we did, and it still exists for us to use here as well. So I mentioned the sun. Well, it's space weather in general can impact all sorts of things. And I heard also today on the air that there was a solar event that occurred during the day, and some of the bands were somewhat closed down today as I listened, because the sun can have a critical effect on high-frequency propagation. And more information can be found at these online resources, DX Heat, Space Weather, Solar Ham, and did you know that we have our own solar weather person? Absolutely. Tamitha Scove, Dr. Tamitha Scove, does a weather forecast for the radio frequency bands. She does, and she's a ham radio operator now. She's gotten involved in amateur radio, so there will be a section in her report dealing with ham radio operators to know how propagation conditions are going to be. So you just go to spaceweatherwoman.com and there will be a link to her YouTube channel. Neat. All right, here we are. Let's see if Gary Blabbing did any good to give you some answers to some test questions. So remember our 3-second rule. Try to wait 3 seconds to give folks watching on YouTube a chance to absorb the question, and then come on in with your answer. All right. So why do VHF signal strengths sometimes vary greatly when the antenna is moved only a few feet?
Delta.
Well, it is Charlie. It's multipath. Yeah, multipath propagation cancels or reinforces signals. And what is the effect of vegetation on UHF and microwave?
B.
Yes, the leaves will absorb radio frequency energy, so absorption at UHF and microwave. And what is the meaning of the term picket fencing?
B.
Let everybody get a chance to read that. Yeah, you see that? Rapid flutter on mobile signals due to multipath propagation. The signal goes up and down and up and down. And what weather condition might decrease range at microwave frequencies?
C.
Yeah, remember NBC and their KU band fiasco? Precipitation, C in this case. And remember, these are the actual questions and the actual answers that you'll see on your test. The answers, though, will not be in the same order. I guarantee that. So don't memorize A, B, C, or D. That won't do you any good. But know the answer. So what is a likely cause of irregular fading of signals propagated by the ionosphere? It is delta. It's another term for multipath. It's the random combining of signals arriving via different paths.
Is that different than picket fencing?
Yes. Picket fencing is caused by reflections off of buildings as you're driving by them. But here we're just talking about the ionosphere. So what effect does multipath propagation have on data transmissions?
Delta.
Delta is correct. The error rates will increase when you have multipath interference. And which region of the atmosphere can refract or bend HF and VHF radio waves?
D.
Did I hear B?
C.
Charlie.
Charlie.
Charlie, C, yes, the ionosphere. Good. And what is the effect of fog and rain on signals in the 10-meter and 6-meter bands?
B.
You have no effect on me. Yes, there is no effect because the wavelengths are too big. And why are simplex UHF signals rarely heard beyond their radio horizon? UHF.
Charlie?
Yeah, UHF signals are not bent back by the ionosphere. UHF signals go right out into space. That's why NASA uses for communications to space vehicles. And what is a characteristic of HF communication compared with communications on VHF and higher? Yeah, HF is we use the ionosphere. We can go out at great distance, thousands of miles, with our radio signals using the ionosphere. And what is a characteristic of VHF signals received via auroral backscatter? You heard it. Yes, they are distorted, sound like the gravelly voice, and signal strength varies considerably.
How does that differ from fluttery?
Well, I mean, fluttery is signal strength up and down. But you heard there, it was distorted. It sounded, almost robotic. That would be my answer. All right, which
Does
of
that
the...
happen all the time?
For aurora, yes. And I made my first aurora contact this year, actually, and it sounded exactly like that. So which of the following types of propagation is most commonly associated with occasional strong signals on the 10, 6, and 2 meter bands from beyond the radio horizon?
Bravo.
Yeah, think about my signal I made on 6 meters out to California one time using the E clouds, the sporadic E. So which of the following effects may allow radio signals to travel beyond obstructions between the transmitting and receiving stations?
Alpha.
Alpha.
Yeah, knife edge diffraction is one of the techniques. Reflection is another. And what type of propagation is responsible for allowing over-the-horizon VHF and UHF communications to ranges of approximately 300 miles on a regular basis?
A.
Yeah, I want you to think of VOA in the Philippines and their tropospheric communications, or tropospheric ducting in this case. So what band is best suited for communicating via meteor scatter?
50 megahertz.
50 megahertz is correct, and that would be which band?
Bravo.
Yeah, Bravo, the 6 meter band. That is correct. Because the wavelength corresponds to the length of the meteor tails. And what causes tropospheric ducting?
Delta.
Yeah, think tropical, think temperatures, temperature inversions. And what is generally the best time for long-distance 10-meter band propagation via the F region?
Alpha.
Alpha is correct. You're doing great. 10 meters likes high sunspots, so we're in a great time for that. And it's a daytime band, so from dawn to shortly after sunset. Noon is probably the best. Which of the following bands may provide long-distance communication via the ionosphere's F region during the peak of the sunspot cycle?
Alpha.
Yeah, remember they ask questions differently, but the same topics. Yes, 10 meters again, 6 and 10 meters with the high sunspots. And why is the radio horizon for VHF and UHF signals more distant than the visual horizon?
Charlie.
Yes, radio waves refract around the curvature of the Earth slightly. Very good. All right, let's carry on. Antenna and radio wave basics. So, I mean, this is a huge topic, and we could spend a entire session on it, but we've got a few minutes, so let's get started. The most basic type of antenna, and it's probably the starter for even more elaborate antennas, is the dipole antenna. And so it's an antenna that is being fed with energy coming from your transmitter. At the center, there's an insulator here. And you have two sides of the antenna. They're equal distance. They're a quarter of a wavelength long at the frequency that you want to operate. And the other side is exactly the same quarter wavelength long. You have insulators out at the ends as well. This is a center-fed half-wave dipole. Half wave? Well, a quarter wave plus a quarter wave is a half wave. So this is a half wave dipole being fed at the center. There are some variations on that, but let's start with that. And radio waves coming from an antenna are created by the combination of electric and magnetic fields. And the electric and magnetic fields at the antenna create an electromagnetic wave. And it looks kind of something like this, with the E field there going up and down, and the B field, or the magnetic field, going left and right. They're at right angles to each other, and the combination of these two create the forward movement of an electromagnetic wave. Now, an antenna's polarization, remember we've got here two fields. We've got the E field in blue going up and down, the E field, the electric field, and the magnetic field going left and right. And the antenna's polarization, by definition, corresponds to the electric field. So the electric field is the antenna's polarization, and that also corresponds to the antenna's physical orientation. So a horizontally polarized antenna is one that is suspended at the ends, for example, and a vertically oriented antenna is like this, where it's up and down. So and this is the physical orientation. It's also the polarization of the electric field. The electric field is the polarization of the antenna. So you see antennas on cars. What do you think? Are these vertically or horizontally polarized?
Vertical.
Yep, you're sticking up. Yep, so they're vertically polarized. And my bonus question is, if you wanted to, this is VHF or UHF, if you wanted to work weak signals and you didn't want to be interfered with by these antennas, you could choose the opposite polarity, or you could choose to use horizontally polarized antennas, and that's what we do. Hams who want to work long distances on VHF and UHF, by convention, use horizontally polarized antennas. One of the reasons is to avoid interference from mobile signals as well. And satellite manufacturers have known this for a long time. I'm just going to go ahead and mute folks here just for a second. Okay, so satellite manufacturers have known this for a long time. In Europe, for example, a lot of TV signals are sent free via satellites over Europe, and inside they've got little dishes, and they've got these low noise block converters here, and inside are horizontal probes and vertical probes, and each one is a separate antenna, and it allows the satellite user or the network to add more channels to a particular satellite, because there's 30 dB or 1,000 times isolation between horizontal and vertical. Now, on the high frequency bands, you'll find both vertical antennas and horizontal antennas. And we don't have the problem, however, of orienting antennas to be the same. Why is that? It's because of the ionosphere. When we send signals up from a transmitter up to the ionosphere, the signal is said to be tumbled, or it comes down with both vertical and horizontal components. So for HF, it doesn't matter. Vertical antennas can be used and horizontal antennas can be used. An interesting phenomenon that I just noticed, though, I put up a vertical antenna here not too long ago, a commercial antenna from DX Commander in England. It's a quarter wave vertical antenna. I'll talk more about it here in a little bit. And there was a station in South America, and I wanted to see if I could communicate with him. And I discovered, for that coming via the ionosphere, the signal was actually stronger on my vertical antenna than it was on my horizontal hex beam, which is a 2-element Yagi. And the reason being is the signal was being tumbled by the ionosphere, but it had more vertical polarization than it did horizontal polarization. There was more of that component. And that allowed my vertical antenna to receive slightly better. So that's just something to keep in mind when we say that it doesn't make any difference. Well, okay, it can make a little bit of difference. So it's nice to have both at your disposal. So signal polarization on HF, the signal coming down from the ionosphere has both H and V components. Speaking of antennas, not the DX Commander, but here's a theoretical antenna that cannot be built. It's called an isotropic radiator. It's also known as a point source antenna. It's a theoretical concept that engineers use. If you had an antenna of minute size that could radiate equally well in all directions, this would be known as an isotropic radiator. And you'll find this used as a comparison in certain antenna manufacturers' gain figures and things like that. Antenna gain an antenna doesn't create power, but what it does is it controls the distribution of power in certain directions. And it does this by, I liken to a balloon, that if you squished the balloon, all of a sudden it goes farther out in these directions. Well, if you turn it on the side and you took the pattern of an antenna and squished it down, then you get more going out, and that's gain. That's gain from an antenna by controlling the pattern. The Yagi antenna is probably one of the more popular types of gain antenna. It has a reflector of some type, a driven element, which might be a half-wave dipole, and then director elements. And was invented by, Dr. Yagi put his name on the antenna, but it was his assistant, Dr. Uda, who actually did all of the hard work, but we still to this day call it a Yagi antenna. But if you'd like to know more about this, when you get this PDF version of this presentation tomorrow in the Dropbox link, you'll go to this link and get the true story of the Yagi antenna. Yagi antennas are very popular for amateur radio operators. Again, it's got a driven element at the middle, usually a half-wave dipole antenna of some type. And then it's got a reflector, which is longer by about 5%, and it's got a director element, which is shorter by about 5%. And they can be both vertically oriented or they can be horizontally oriented. They can be used for VHF, UHF, or they can be used for high frequencies. Of course, the high frequency band antennas are going to be much, much bigger. And I mentioned that isotropic radiator, and I mentioned antenna gain. Antenna gain is measured in decibels. And so here's the complete formula if you want to compare power levels between two things and know the decibel relationship. It's a logarithmic relationship. You really only need to know these three values. That 3 dB, if something has a 3 dB gain, that means it's twice the power, or multiplying by 2. Or you can say minus 3 dB, and that would be dividing it in half. 6 dB is 4 times, and 10 dB is 10 times. But all of these other things that I'm saying over here are absolutely true, that a 1 dB increase is about a 20% increase. But for our class, for the purposes here, and remember, 3 dB times 2, 6 dB times 4, 10 dB times 10. And if we had an omnidirectional vertical antenna, for example, like the DX Commander I mentioned earlier, this is the pattern of that antenna. The antenna is vertical at the center of this donut, and you can see that it's omnidirectional. It goes out equally well in all directions. Whereas our Yagi antenna, this is the directivity that antenna has. It's got a main lobe going out in this direction. It's got minor lobes here. It's got a back lobe here, and it's got null points here. And all of this patterning of antennas can be modeled on computers. And there are actually free programs that hams can use to actually do this. It's an art, and you have to know what you're doing, but you can do the calculations. So if we get our half-wave dipole up in the air, we can do well with just a half-wave dipole. Something to know, though, that as you bring a dipole antenna lower to the ground, the elevation angle of the signal coming off of the antenna goes higher. So that you can see here that it's not going sideways, but it's actually going up in the air. And if we go even lower to the ground, 0.125 wavelengths above the ground, most of the energy goes way up into the sky. We call it a cloud burner, sends the energy up, but it's refracted or reflected back down to the Earth. Preppers like this antenna, tactical military folks like this antenna. It's a near vertical incident skywave antenna where you can send signals up to the ionosphere and come back down maybe on the other side of a mountain. Where VHF, UHF couldn't get through the mountain, you can go up to the ionosphere, back down on the other side of the mountain and have communications. That's a NIVIS antenna. All right, here's some questions. What happens when antennas at opposite ends of a VHF or UHF line of sight radio link are not using the same polarization?
Bravo.
Yeah, for VHF and UHF it matters, and receive signal strength will be reduced. You need to have like polarity antennas. All right, and which of the following results from the fact that signals propagated by the ionosphere are elliptically polarized, and it's tumbled?
Bravo.
Yeah, you can use either vertically or horizontally polarized antennas for transmission or reception. And what is the relationship between the electric and magnetic fields of an electromagnetic wave?
Delta.
Delta is correct. They are at right angles with each other. And what property of a radio wave defines its polarization?
Alpha.
Yes, the electric field, the orientation of the electric field. And what are the two components of a radio wave?
Charlie.
Yes, Charlie is right. The electric and the magnetic fields, which we said earlier, are at right angles with each other. Okay, which decibel value most closely represents a power increase from 5 watts to 10 watts?
B.
Bravo.
B is correct. 3 dB is times 2. All right. Which decibel value most closely represents a power decrease from 12 watts to 3 watts? So we use a negative sign to indicate a decrease.
C.
Yes, C is correct. It's minus 6 dB. Divide by 4. And which decibel value represents a power increase from 20 watts to 200 watts?
Alpha.
Alpha is correct, 10 dB. Those are the three that we want you to know. So what is antenna gain?
Charlie.
Yes, it's the increase in signal strength in a specified direction compared to a reference antenna, and that reference antenna might be the isotropic that we talked about. It could also be a half-wave dipole. Both are used. And you have done great. We're just a little over an hour into the class. Let's take 5 minutes for an intermission. Get up, move around, stretch, get something to drink, and we'll come back in 5 minutes to complete sections 4.3 and 4.4, and a little bonus for you as well. So come on back in 5 minutes. And we're back. This is a feature-rich chapter. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of meat in this chapter, a lot of interesting topics. Antennas are the things that ham radio operators, even if they're not going to get in and repair their radios or things like that, you can build your own antennas. And that makes it interesting. But we're going to cover some of the basic principles. And right now we're going to talk about feed lines and standing wave ratio, SWR. Section 4.3. And transmission system parts typically have nominal impedances. And you might remember that impedance is the combination of resistance and reactance. So we won't go much in detail other than the next slide. So your sources of RF energy, like your transmitter, is going to have a rated output impedance, typically 50 ohms. The feed line going out to your antenna is also going to have a characteristic impedance. For hams, coaxial cable we use is typically 50 ohms. And then the antenna itself can be adjusted in many cases to provide a good match, or you can adjust it to be 50 ohms. The thing is, when you have impedance matching between all of these various parts, it provides for the maximum transfer of power from your transmitter to the various devices. And as I mentioned, that impedance is a magnitude and a phase angle. It's a combination of resistance and reactance. And in the technician class, you don't need to know a lot of details about this, but we will talk a little bit more about it here in a second, especially with regards to resonant circuits. So feed line impedances, I mentioned 50 ohms. That's the most popular type of coaxial cable that amateur radio operators can use. Now the pros will use air-insulated hardline, which is either 50 or 75 ohms. That's the lowest loss kind of cable. A lot of hams, if they can find surplus hardline, they'll use that if they can. Ladder line is an oldie but a goodie, 450 ohm impedance. Twin lead, the old TV antenna, parallel wires coming down, that was twin lead, 300 ohms. That's still used by hams in some respects. So here's our coaxial cable, 50 ohms. Here's our 300 ohm twin lead. Here's our ladder line. Normally, though, you want to have impedance matching going on so that the characteristic impedance of the feed line is very close to, for example, the impedance of a dipole antenna. And the half-wave dipole antenna nominal impedance, it varies with height, is around 73 ohms, which is a fairly good match to 50 ohm coax cable. That works out fine. Now, coaxial cable, it's easy to use, it's convenient, you don't have to worry about running it up next to metal objects, it doesn't care. So convenience for coax is a benefit, but there are things that can go negative with the coax, and that's feed line losses, for example. Coax cable will actually have an attenuation depending on the number of feet you have out there, and it shows up as a heating of the cable. So the number one rule with coaxial cable and its connectors is to keep it dry, because moisture will, in coaxial cable, increase power loss, and that's something that we don't want to do. So always keep your cable and connections dry and weatherproof, for example. Now, I mentioned air-insulated hardline that the big boys use, the broadcast industry and whatnot. It's the lowest loss of coaxial types, but it generally has to be pressurized, either using nitrogen, you see the canister there on the right, or dry air that has been dehumidified, and it's kept under pressure. The reason? To keep moisture out. So the same problem exists there. But no matter what you're using, whether it be this expensive air-insulated hardline or normal coaxial cable, cable loss goes up with frequency. As the frequency goes up, no matter how much money you spend for your cable, the power loss will go up. Now, some cables are better than others and for higher frequencies, and that's why we choose them. But this is a general truth, that as frequency goes up, power loss will go up. Here's some common coaxial cables used by amateur radio operators. On the left is a smaller 50 ohm coax RG58. And on the right here is a larger diameter RG213. One of the characteristics of RG213, this larger cable, is that it has lower losses at all frequencies when compared to smaller RG58 cable, for example. I use all RG213 here at my ham shack, and it seems to work out fine and is very reliable. All right, so I mentioned that we want to match impedances, and so we're going to try to demystify something called standing wave ratio. And if anybody's been in the CB world, SWR is a topic that is talked about all the time. And it's not magic, it's all about matching impedances, because if we have a transmitter with a source impedance of 50 ohms, we have a cable with a characteristic impedance of 50 ohms, and an antenna with a load of 50 ohms, everything is going to be fine. So I want you to calmly think here of ocean waves coming in off of the ocean, and they're coming in, and they come in, and they're going to hit the shoreline, and they will bounce back. Why do they bounce back? Well, because there's a discontinuity. It's not the flat surface of the ocean anymore. That wave goes on and on and on as long as it's a flat surface. But the minute it hits a discontinuity, think impedance change, then it reflects back. And that's what happens with energy that comes from a transmitter from the left going to a load on the right, and it's an open circuit in this case. And all of the energy that goes from the transmitter is reflected back to the transmitter. This is an infinite standing wave ratio. All of the power that is being transmitted is coming back. Now, that's not likely what's going to happen. More likely, something like this is going to happen, which is a partial reflection of energy. So you see the big pulse of energy going from the transmitter on the left to the load on the right, and much of the energy, about half of it, let's say, is being absorbed by the antenna, the load in this case, but about half of the energy, maybe a little less, is being reflected back. That's a typical operating scenario in an amateur radio station. Did you notice that the polarity changed there? Before it was positive going and it became negative going on the reflected. That has to do with whether you're going into a higher impedance or a lower impedance. In this case, it's going into a lower impedance. And this is another look at that same scenario there, with some of the energy being absorbed by the antenna and some of it going back. And what I wanted to point out here is this is going from a higher impedance to a lower impedance. That's when you get the polarity reversal. And here is going from a lower impedance to a higher impedance. You get a reflected wave, but it's the same polarity. More information than you really need to know, but it is useful later on as we go. So hitting an open circuit on the top, open circuit is on the bottom. Open circuit's on the bottom, and a short circuit, where you have a connection between the center of the coax and the shield, is on the top. All of the energy is being reflected in both cases, but the polarity reverses when on the short-circuited one. That's a low impedance. So what we want is this. We want all of the energy that we transmit from our transmitter, 100 watts, let's say, we want it all to transfer down the coaxial feed line and be absorbed and radiated by the antenna. That's our goal. But when we get this reflected wave back, let's look at it in a different view. So if you look at the blue, if you can see there, going from left to right, the wave is coming from the antenna and going toward the load on the right. And coming back is the red. That's the reflected power coming back from the antenna and going to the transmitter on the left here. When the voltages add up, you get this wave that forms on the transmission line, but it doesn't travel. It's stationary, or it stands. This is the standing wave. Without reflected power, you do not have any standing waves on the transmission line. But when there is reflected power, this is the kind of thing that happens. You have voltage peaks and voltage minimums along the transmission line. So what we're looking for is a matched load impedance, and when we have that, we say that the standing wave ratio is 1 to 1. 1 to 1 is perfect. Again, nothing is perfect. So here's a meter that's indicating a standing wave ratio of 1.14 to 1. Or you can have a standing wave ratio of 2 to 1. We'll see what that means here in just a second. But what we're looking for is a standing wave ratio, perfect match, 1 to 1. And we get these readings by using something called an SWR meter. It's installed between your transmitter's output and the antenna feed line. And they come in various different forms. Here's a very inexpensive one. But here are some other ones. Here's a very expensive Telepost LP100, very high quality. Here's one for VHF and UHF. Note that not all SWR and power meters are created equally. They're made for different frequency ranges, they're made for different power levels, and they're made with different characteristics and calibration standards and tolerances. So not all SWR meters are created equally. You always got to keep in mind what power level, what frequency to getting the right SWR meter. A directional watt meter, like this from Bird, can be used to calculate standing wave ratio by making measurements of forward power. You can't really see, but there's a port, I call it the goes in a port, and over here on the other side is a goes out a port. And so with power coming in and going out, and this slug right here is the arrow is pointing in that direction, the meter will indicate the amount of power going out from the transmitter. If you take the slug and turn that arrow pointing in the opposite direction, then it measures the reflected power coming back, and using those two readings, there's a little chart on the back, you can calculate standing wave ratio. And remember, 1 to 1 is what we're looking for. 3 to 1 is a 25% reflected power coming back, and that is indicative of impedance mismatch. Anything above 3 to 1, and generally anything under 2 to 1. Notice the bigger number is always first. So you can have a 2 to 1 standing wave ratio. You can't have a 1 to 2. That's not right. 2 to 1, that's anything under 2 to 1 is generally considered okay. Above 3 to 1, you run into trouble, and most solid state transmitters now, the ICOM 7300, for example, here, will begin to reduce power output when it senses a standing wave ratio above 2 to 1. It says, ooh, there's an impedance mismatch going on. That power is coming back into the radio. I don't like that. I'm going to reduce the output power. So your 100-watt radio suddenly becomes a 50-watt radio. So that's another reason that we want to have matched impedances. So, well, Gary, I can't really make any adjustments on my antenna, and I've got a standing wave ratio of 3 to 1. What can I do? Well, you can usually add something like this. It's known as an antenna tuner or an antenna coupler. It's located after the standing wave ratio meter and before the coax and the antenna. And what this does, we talked about the rebound wave of the ocean. Well, this generates a rebound wave with the reflected power that comes back to the transmitter. It bounces it back to the antenna by doing something called a conjugate match. It uses tuned components, inductor and capacitor, maybe as simple as an L network here with a coil in the series leg and a capacitor parallel to that. You can actually have the capacitor on the input side. There are different configurations. So this is an L network tuner. Or you can have something called a pi network tuner because it looks like the Greek letter pi. and you've got here variable capacitors on the input and output side to make the adjustments to get that perfect standing wave ratio match to make the transmitter happy, so you get your full 100 watts out and the energy gets out to the antenna. All right, here's some questions. Which of the following should be considered when selecting an accessory standing wave ratio meter?
Alpha?
Yeah, you want to know about the frequency and the power level at which the measurements will be made. And then you can make a decision on which meter you would like to utilize. And what reading on an SWR meter indicates a perfect impedance match? Charlie is correct, 1 to 1. And why do most solid-state transmitters reduce output power as SWR increases?
So the smoke doesn't come out.
So the smoke doesn't come out. Perfect. Yeah, you've got that power coming back from the antenna. It's got to go someplace, and it's going to overheat the output amplifier transistors in the radio. So to prevent that, the radio reduces its transmitter power. So it's just protecting itself. And what does an SWR reading of 4 to 1 indicate?
Smoke.
No.
See?
D, yes, impedance mismatch. And what happens to power lost in a feed line?
Charlie.
Yeah, it's converted into heat. And what is a benefit of low SWR?
Bravo.
Reduce signal loss on transmission, and it also helps to prevent signal loss on reception as well. And what is the most common impedance of coaxial cables used in ham radio?
Bravo.
Yep, 50 ohms. And why is coaxial cable the most common feed line for amateur radio antenna systems?
Alpha.
Alpha.
Yeah, it's easy to use, it's convenient, and it requires few special installation considerations. And what happens as the frequency of a signal in coaxial cable is increased?
Delta.
Yeah, the loss will always increase as well. So a coaxial cable that might be perfect for use on the HF or 3 to 30 megahertz range might have too high a loss at VHF or UHF. So what can cause erratic changes in SWR? Think about this.
Bravo.
Yeah, if you had a loose connection where it's shorting out or it's opening up, and that'll give you reflected power coming back and give you erratic readings. And which of the following types of feed line has the lowest loss at VHF and UHF? What do the big boys use?
Charlie.
Yeah, the air-insulated hard line. And what is standing wave ratio?
Alpha.
Yeah, it's a measure of how well a load is being matched to a transmission line. You're doing great. All right, practical antenna systems. There's what you want in your backyard. Your HOA will love that. That is
Hey, Gary, a quick question.
Yes, please.
When you're saying the coax cable gets...
Whoop, I lost you. You muted.
Sorry.
Yeah.
When you were saying that coax cable dissipates heat, you know, as the loss, is it like warm or could it burn you? I mean,
No, not that hot, but that's where it goes.
Okay, so it's like electrical wires in your house. It's
Correct.
not you really can feel it's hot.
Correct.
Okay.
No, not generally. No. All right. Good question, though. Appreciate it. So this is a curtain antenna at the Voice of America transmitting station in Greenville, North Carolina. They still have antennas this tall at the B site, and it's an antenna with a transmission gain of 20 dB. We said 10 dB is times 10. 20 dB is 10 times 10, or 100. That's a lot of power gain, but I don't think your HOA is going to approve one of these. So you're likely going to start with something like a simple half-wave dipole antenna, like we've talked about, feeding at the center with a quarter wavelength on each side, making the total length a half of a wavelength. I want to point this out. We talked about the metric prefixes and whatnot, and in America we still use inches and feet and whatnot. But note that 1 meter is about 39 inches long. And that's going to be important here as we move along. So just keep that in mind. How long is a half-wave dipole antenna? Well, here is the formula. 468 divided by the frequency in megahertz times a velocity factor correction. If you use insulated wire, it reduces, for example, the length that is necessary. But 468 divided by the frequency in megahertz will roughly give you how long your half-wave dipole needs to be in feet. So there's something to keep in mind. And our half-wave dipole, this is what's happening in the half-wave dipole. There's a current maximum at the center. That's what the blue is all about. The radio frequency current is going up and down here at the center. And there's a radio frequency voltage. The voltage peaks are at the end. So high voltage at the ends, that's why we have the insulators. High current at the middle. And from the dipole antenna, if we look down on top of the dipole antenna, the signal is being radiated out broadside to the antenna. So the maximum signal strength from a dipole antenna comes from broadside to the antenna. Very little radiation off of the ends. So we're looking down on top of the antenna, for example, here, which is oriented vertically. Same thing on reception. The E field of a radio signal is coming in, and it excites the antenna and generates voltage in the antenna, which is taken out to your receiver, which allows you then to receive signals. And as I mentioned, the strongest signal, again looking down at the axis of the antenna here, in this case is horizontal, is broadside to a dipole antenna. It's a figure 8 pattern, looking down from overhead. So here we have two dipole antennas, one which is much longer than the other. What do you think the relationship to frequency is? Remember, each of these antennas, the longer one is lower frequency, is correct. Because it has to, remember, these are half of a wavelength long at the frequency of interest. So this longer antenna is for a lower frequency signal, whereas this smaller antenna is for a higher frequency antenna. So that's a key concept. The longer an antenna, the lower its resonant frequency. The shorter an antenna, the higher its resonant frequency. And an antenna is resonant at certain frequencies. And antenna resonance can be considered with a series case of a capacitor and an inductor in series, or it can also be considered as a parallel case with a capacitor and an inductor in parallel. Maximum impedance here at the resonant frequency, minimum impedance here. These both can be used to model antennas. So half wavelength long. Let's go on out and take a look over at the green screen, if you would. Sorry, got to catch up with you here. I'm over at the green screen. So here we have a half wavelength antenna. I've got a an SO239 connector here. This is a working antenna for 2 meters. I cut it for 146.610, one of the local repeaters here. And the center conductor of coax goes out to the white, and the ground side of the connector goes out to the black. And so this is a half wavelength for the 2 meter band. 2 meter is the full wavelength. Half wavelength would be 1 meter, and we can prove it because here's a meter stick. Whoops, I'm right in the same frame there, kind of. I'm not coordinated. And the camera is actually reversed orientation. So roughly the same. So when we're talking about the 2 meter band, for example, we're talking about 2 of these for the full wavelength. Do it like that. Whereas a half wavelength for a half wavelength dipole is here, all right? Now, and this can be a horizontally polarized antenna, remember the electric field, or it can be a vertically oriented antenna. Get the white going up, that's better. This is a vertically oriented antenna. All right. There is something, though, that you can do to shorten this antenna, and that's, let me put my meter stick away. If you take this antenna, so this is half wavelength, but we take the bottom and we bend it. Now it's only a quarter of a wavelength tall. And it's got this going out over here, which we call a radial. And normally you have a series of radials that go 360 degrees around a quarter wave vertical antenna. Remember I said I put up a DX Commander vertical antenna recently? That's essentially what that is. It's a quarter wavelength at the particular frequency of interest with a series of radials like this that make it go around. So let's head on back over here.
So that doesn't cause a problem with the orientation of the antennas where they both want to be horizontal or they both want to be vertical?
If you're on VHF or UHF, it's always best to have them matched in the same polarity. Then you'll get the best signal reception. For HF, because of the tumbling in the ionosphere, it doesn't matter.
Oh, okay.
All right. So let's look at the presentation here. This is the quarter wave vertical antenna. Again, it's a resonant antenna, but its height, though, is only half of the dipole because, as you saw there, we bent it. And then we have these radials going out over here that make kind of a mirror. It mirrors the other half of the dipole antenna. So it's a quarter wavelength high. And for mobile operation, you'll see quarter wavelength mobile antennas. You'll also see 5/8 wave vertical antennas, which are slightly longer. The 5/8 wavelength antenna uses a matching section at the base of the antenna, where you don't really require that as much for the quarter wave. And it has a lower angle of radiation, which is why 5/8 wave VHF antennas say we have longer range than a quarter wave. It's true because it moves the angle of radiation down a little lower, so you get stronger signals. And with mobile antennas, just be aware that if you can have centered roof mounting, that's going to provide the most uniform pattern of coverage. All right, I'm going to scare you here. Stand by. Here is the frequency, here is the formula for the resonant frequency of an LC circuit. You don't have to memorize it yet, but when you get to the extra class, you will. But it's 1/2 pi square root of L as the inductor measured in henries, and C, the capacitor measured in farads. The only thing I want to point out from this formula is that the frequency of resonance, whoops, let me get over here, frequency of resonance, if you increase inductance or if you increase capacitance, it's 1/. So it's going to be inversely related. So the frequency, resonant frequency will go down. So if you add inductance or add capacitance, the frequency, the resonant frequency will go down. And I had a question in the break asking about mobile antennas and why aren't mobile antennas for HF, really, really tall? It's because they add inductance at the center of the antenna. It could be helically wound inductance or it could be a lumped inductance like you see here. This is known as a loaded antenna. It makes the antenna look electrically longer because of this inductance added into the antenna. And you can add inductance or you could add capacitance. Either one of the two will electrically lengthen the antenna to be resonant on an HF band on a very, very short antenna, for example. You don't get something for nothing, though. The matching bandwidth is very, very narrow, so it will only operate over a certain range of frequencies because of this loading. Oh, here's our Yagi. Again, remember the Yagi antenna. It's directional toward the shortest element. So here's our half-wave dipole, wave divided by 2. That's lambda divided by 2, half-wave dipole. Here we have a director that's 5% shorter than the driven element, a reflector that's 5% longer than the driven element. Another directional antenna that you might be able to use at home is the cubical quad antenna, which was invented in Ecuador. It uses a full wave driven element and then full wave reflector that's 5% longer than the driven, and director is 5% shorter than the driven. So that's a cubical quad antenna. For VHF, UHF, and above, you might be able to have a directional dish antenna. Satellite antennas, for example, are highly directional. Whatever antenna you're going to be using, though, one handy thing to have is an antenna analyzer. And this is a unit from MFJ that just recently went out of business, but you'll find these at Hamfest. This is the 259. It measures antenna impedance and resonant frequency without having to transmit into the antenna. It has a built-in generator inside the device. You just hook it up to your antenna and make some adjustments, and you'll see how the antenna is performing, where its resonant frequency is. Do you have to lengthen it? Do you have to shorten it? What other adjustments would you need to do to improve it? Rubber duck antennas. These are the antennas that come with an HT when you buy it. They're not very effective. Very poor, especially inside of a car, because a car is going to shield signals coming to and from the HT. So just be aware of that. Connectors that we use to connect up on a little antenna or a little radio like this. Bruce, if you can come to me just for a second. These are called SMA connectors. SMA connector on the radio and female SMA connector on the antenna here. That's one of the connectors that are used in ham radio, but there are others. There's the UHF connector or PL259. There's the N connector. Come on back to the laptop, please. Whoops, I hadn't advanced the slide. So there's SMA, that's what we just talked about here on the radio. Here's the N connector from Mr. Neal, an engineer at AT&T. There's the bayonet connector or BNC connector, and then there's the UHF connector. These are generally okay up to about 300 megahertz, but for higher frequencies, you want one of these others. The SMA is really good, all the way up to 18 gigahertz. So it's a good connector. It's not as robust as some of the other. The most popular kind of connector, though, for the HF is going to be the PL259, also known as the UHF connector. It's the most popular, and you install it on a cable using a soldering iron and rosin core solder, always rosin core, never acid core. You can't find acid core so much anymore, but I have problems with this soldering the braid, exactly what they're showing you there. So I've moved exclusively to using crimp connectors that crimp the braid with a ferrule and gets a good connection there, and you solder the center conductor. I find these to be a lot more reliable, at least for me. We mentioned the N connector from Mr. Neal, an engineer at AT&T. He designed it. It's waterproof. Remember I said that coax, the biggest problem is moisture and water? Well, this is a waterproof connector. It's got a rubber gasket on the inside here, and it's got shielding here on the center, and it's got shielding around here. So the N connector is great for signals above 400 megahertz. And again, soldering, I mentioned, never use acid core solder, always use rosin core solder. And when you're doing soldering, whether it be on a connector or on a printed circuit board, you want something that's shiny and smooth, not rough and lumpy. This would be called a cold solder joint, also known as a bad solder joint. All right, questions? What antenna polarization is normally used for long-distance CW and single sideband contacts on the VHF and UHF bands? This goes back to our question about avoiding interference from mobile signals.
Charlie.
Yes, we want to be horizontal. And when using a directional antenna, how might your station be able to communicate with a distant repeater if buildings or obstructions are blocking? We're going back.
Bravo.
Yes, try to find a path that reflects signals to the repeater. All right, where should an RF power meter be installed?
Alpha?
Delta.
No, it is alpha. An RF power meter. Also, SWR meters are also power meters, so it should be installed in the feed line between the transmitter and antenna. You want to measure the RF power that is coming out of the transmitter. And which of the following...
Was a tricky one, though, that they threw in there.
Yeah, there you go. Which of the following is used to determine if an antenna is resonant at a desired operating frequency?
B.
Yeah, that's your antenna analyzer, like the one from MFJ I showed you there. And which instrument can be used to determine SWR?
Delta.
Yes. Caught me getting a drink of water there. Directional watt meter can be used by measuring the power from the goes in to the goes out in one direction, and then in the reverse direction, and using the chart on the back.
The FCC has a sense of humor with choice C.
Yeah, what was choice C? Oh, the iambic pentameter, yes. Which of the following causes failure of coaxial cables?
A.
Moisture. Water is always the problem, yes. And why should the outer jacket of coaxial cable be resistant to UV light?
Delta.
Yeah, water is always the problem. Ultraviolet light can damage the jacket and allow water to enter. What is a disadvantage of air core coaxial cable when compared to foam or solid dielectric?
Charlie.
Yes, you have to pressurize the cable with either nitrogen or dry air. It requires these special techniques to prevent moisture. And which of the following types of solder should not be used for radio and electronic applications?
A.
Yeah, it used to be used in plumbing, but not so much anymore. So what is the characteristic appearance of a cold tin lead solder joint?
C.
Yep, a rough or lumpy surface. Perfect. And what is a beam antenna? Yeah, Yagi is a beam antenna. It's an antenna that concentrates signals in one direction. And which of the following describes a type of antenna loading?
A. That was my question. So I'm
Yeah,
taking that.
that's it. You got it. Electrically lengthening by inserting inductors in the radiating elements. And which of the following describes a simple dipole oriented parallel to the Earth's surface?
D.
Bravo is correct. Both the physical orientation and the orientation of the electric field describe the polarity of an antenna, so a horizontally polarized antenna. And what is a disadvantage of the short, flexible antenna supplied with most handheld radio transceivers compared to a full-size quarter-wave antenna?
Alpha.
Yeah, the little rubber duck has very low efficiency. Doesn't radiate very well. I don't know if you can hear it, but it's raining heavily here. So which of the following increases the resonant frequency of a dipole antenna? So you want to increase the resonant frequency of a dipole antenna, and you do it by?
A.
No.
Shortening C.
Remember, it's inversely proportional to the, so if as the frequency goes up, let's see, which of the following increases the resonance? Yes, so shortening it. Smaller antennas for higher frequencies. And which of the following types of antenna offers the greatest gain?
D.
Yep, the Yagi in this case, out of these. And what is a disadvantage of using a handheld VHF transceiver with a flexible antenna inside a vehicle?
Alpha.
Yep, signal strength is reduced due to the shielding effect of the vehicle. All right, what is the approximate length in inches of a quarter wavelength vertical antenna for 146 megahertz? All right, we got a couple of different things going on here. So anybody remember the formula for calculating a half wave dipole in feet? Come on over to the calculator cam. So here's our calculator. Oh, I got to put my glasses on so I can see. So the formula for okay, you're kind of broken up there. I couldn't quite understand that, but the formula is 468 divided by the frequency in megahertz. So if we put in 468 divided by, and we said 146, right? Yep, okay. 146, and we hit enter, then it is 3.27 feet. All right, that's for a half wave dipole antenna, but we're looking for a quarter wavelength vertical. Isn't that right? Yes. So it's going to be half of this. So we can take this times 0.5. Whoops. Well, that didn't work. Okay, 1.6. So 1.6 feet, all right? I'm going to clear this just for 1.6 times 12 inches, 19 inches. So let's go back to our question. What is the approximate length in inches of a quarter wavelength vertical antenna for 146 megahertz?
C.
It's C, 19 inches. That's what we just calculated.
You know, that one, it's not that hard because that's like a 2-meter wave, right?
Exactly. And if we look at, let's go back to the green screen.
1/4 of a meter.
Go back to the yep. So here we have it. This is a 2-meter antenna, and on the opposite side of the meter stick are inches, and I can actually measure it, and you can see it's about 19 inches, close to it, about 17 inches on this one, but that's because it's insulated wire. So, yep. All right, let's carry on. What is the approximate length in inches of a half wavelength 6-meter dipole antenna? So you could take, we can do it again. Let's go over to our kit.
112 inches.
So but let's see how we got there. Let's clear out our thing. So we're looking at 468 divided by, and 6-meter band, so it's 50 megahertz. So I'm just going to say 50. All right. It's 9.3 feet. And if we times that by 12, 112. So that's how you do that.
I may have missed it, but where did the 468 come from?
It's a formula you find in your book, and it was one of the formulas I presented earlier on in the presentation.
Right, but what does it stand for?
It's just it's a constant. It was just Americans like to work in feet and inches, and so the American Radio Relay League came up with this formula so that if you wanted to calculate how long your dipole antenna should be in feet, this is the constant that you use. It's
Can
not.
you put that question one more time?
Pardon?
Can you put that question up one more time?
Yeah. What is the approximate length in inches of a half wavelength 6-meter dipole antenna? And the formula to find a half wavelength antenna in feet is 468 divided by the frequency in megahertz, which we did, and then we multiplied that by 12 to get it into inches, and we ended up with 112 inches.
I
Go
gotta
back.
tell you though, for the exam, I'm not using that formula.
You don't have to. Use what
I mean,
works
a
for
half
you.
of 6 is 3 meters. 3 meters is, that's,
Perfect.
since they give you such a huge variation in inches, it's pretty easy.
That's normally the way I would have taught it, but I tried to teach it a different way this time to see if it would stick a little better. But okay, absolutely fine. You can do that. That works fine. So in which direction does a half-wave dipole antenna radiate the strongest signal? Blech.
Delta.
Yes, delta, broadside to the antenna. And what is an advantage of a 5/8 wavelength whip antenna for VHF or UHF mobile service?
A,
Yeah, it has slightly more gain than a quarter wavelength because it has a lower angle of radiation. And what is the major function of an antenna tuner or antenna coupler?
alpha.
Yes, it makes the transceiver happy. It matches the antenna system impedance to the transceiver's output impedance. And then you get full output power. So which of the following RF connector types is most suitable for frequencies above 400 megahertz? Think
The
about
only
Mr.
one I remember you mentioning was B.
Yep, Mr. Neal from AT&T. He's the one that invented it, the type N. Yep. And which of the following is true of PL259 type coax connectors?
Hurley.
Yep, they're the most popular, the most common. And which of the following is a source of loss in coaxial feed line? Read carefully.
D.
Yeah, water intrusion, that's a problem. High SWR and multiple connectors in the line, all of those choices could be sources of loss. And what is the electrical difference between RG58, the small stuff, and RG213?
Charlie.
Yep, RG213 has less loss at any given frequency. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of Chapter 4, and we are running out of time. It's right at the end of our period, and so I just want to say thank you. Are there any comments or questions before we go tonight?
Thank you.
It is my pleasure. Hang in there. You're doing great. Let's keep going, and we'll do Chapter 5 next week. Until then, 73, y'all, and watch out for that hurricane.
Thank you.
Thank you.